In 1994, a German archaeologist knelt on a bare hilltop in Turkey and brushed the dust of a slab of limestone. What he found underneath had been buried for 12,000 years. It was not a tomb. It was not a city. It was a temple, built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 5,000 years before the first known city on Earth, by people who had no metal, no wheels, no farms, and no written language. Hunter-gatherers. They carved pillars taller than a house, weighing as much as a loaded city bus, covered them with images of vultures and scorpions and headless figures, and then they buried it all, deliberately, and walked away. For 31 years before that archaeologist arrived, the oldest temple on Earth had been sitting under a wheat field. Farmers plowed over it every season, complaining about the rocks. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe, the place that broke the timeline of human civilization, rewrote the origin of religion, and may contain a 12,000-year-old calendar carved into stone by people who watched something fall from the sky. Hit subscribe and drop a like, and let's go deeper. In the autumn of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stood on a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey, squinting at something that shouldn't have been there. The hill had no name that mattered to anyone outside the nearest village. Locals called it Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, because of the way the ground swelled upward like a clenched fist rising from the Haran plain. Schmidt had not come here by accident. He had come because of a footnote. 31 years earlier, in 1963, an American anthropologist named Peter Benedict had walked this same ridge as part of a joint survey between the University of Chicago and Istanbul University. Benedict noted a scatter of flint tools and broken limestone slabs across the hilltop. He classified the site as an abandoned medieval cemetery, filed his report, and moved on. That report gathered dust in an archive for 3 decades. No one questioned the classification. The hill sat forgotten. The hill sat undisturbed while the village at its base grew, while farmers planted wheat across the mound, while their plows scraped against something hard beneath the topsoil, something they cursed as stubborn rock and dragged aside. Schmidt had spent the previous years excavating a site called Nevalachori, a smaller Neolithic settlement 60 kilometers to the north. It was a quiet, meticulous dig, T-shaped limestone pillars, carved animal reliefs, ritual deposits. Then the Turkish government built the Ataturk Dam, and the rising waters of the Euphrates swallowed Nevalachori whole. The site vanished beneath a reservoir. Schmidt's work disappeared under 40 meters of water. He needed a new site. So he did what archaeologists rarely do. He went back to old survey records, other people's discarded notes, looking for anything that might have been misread. Benedict's 1963 report stopped him cold. The flint scatter described on Göbekli Tepe did not match any medieval pattern Schmidt had ever seen. The lithic profile, the shapes of the tools, the density of debitage, pointed somewhere else entirely. It pointed to the pre-pottery Neolithic, 10,000 years before Christ. Schmidt drove to the hill that October. The landscape offered nothing dramatic. Dry grass, a few low trees, a village road 200 meters to the south. 760 meters above sea level, a wind that smelled like dust and thyme. He walked the surface. Within hours, he found it. a flat edge of worked limestone jutting from the soil at an angle that no natural fracture could produce. He recognized the geometry immediately, the same T-shaped profile he had spent years documenting at Navali Chori. Except this slab was larger, much larger. Schmidt knelt beside the limestone edge, brushed the dry earth with his fingers, and then stopped. He did not need to dig further to know what was underneath. The shape told him everything. The flint told him the age, and the scale told him something else, something that no archaeologist in 1994 was prepared to hear, that the oldest monumental architecture on Earth was not in Mesopotamia, not in Egypt, not anywhere that civilization was supposed to have begun. It was here, under a wheat field, on a hill that an American anthropologist had dismissed as a graveyard. What Schmidt uncovered over the next 2 decades would force archaeology to reconsider everything it thought it knew about when civilization began. Excavations began in 1995. Within the first season, Schmidt's team uncovered the top of a monolithic limestone pillar, T-shaped, 3.5 meters tall, weighing roughly 10 tons. It was standing upright in the soil, exactly where someone had placed it. Radiocarbon samples from the surrounding matrix came back from the lab with a date that nobody expected. 9,500 years before the Common Era. The early pre-pottery Neolithic A period when humanity had no agriculture, no metal, no pottery, and supposedly no architecture more complex than a mud hut. That first pillar was not alone. As the dig expanded, more emerged, arranged in rough circles, each ring containing between 8 and 12 upright pillars facing inward toward 2 taller pillars at the center. 4 main enclosures have been fully excavated so far, labeled A through D by the archaeological team. Enclosure D is the largest and oldest. Its 2 central pillars rise 5.5 meters above the bedrock floor, the height of a 2-story house, and each weighs between 40 and 60 tons. That is roughly the mass of a loaded city bus balanced on a limestone base, placed there by people who had never seen a wheel. The pillars are not rough monoliths. They are carefully shaped, with flat front faces and narrow side profiles. Many have a slight widening at the top, a horizontal capstone element that gives them their distinctive T-shape. Schmidt recognized the form from his previous excavations, but the Göbekli Tepe examples were larger by an order of magnitude. Between the pillars, low stone walls form the perimeter of each enclosure, creating semi-enclosed oval spaces roughly 10 to 20 meters across. The floors are smooth bedrock, cut and leveled by hand. No windows. No doors in the conventional sense. Access appears to have been from above, down into the enclosure, like descending into a pit. 6,000 years before the first stone was laid at Stonehenge. 5,000 years before the oldest known city at Uruk. 4,000 years before the Great Pyramid at Giza. The structures at Göbekli Tepe predate every example of monumental architecture in every textbook of Western civilization. When these circles were built, the Sahara was still green, Britain was still connected to continental Europe, and the last ice age had barely ended. In 2018, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization inscribed Göbekli Tepe as a World Heritage Site. The official citation called it one of the first manifestations of human-made monumental architecture. The dating remains uncontested. The construction is real. The engineering is measurable. 9,500 years before the Common Era. The dates alone were extraordinary, but the real shock came when archaeologists examined the builders themselves and realized there were no cities nearby, no grain stores, no evidence of farming, only the scattered camps of hunter-gatherers who should not have been capable of building anything at all. The limestone bedrock on and around Göbekli Tepe is soft enough to cut when freshly exposed, but hardens rapidly once it meets air. Neolithic quarry workers, and the marks prove they were exactly that, exploited this property with brutal efficiency. They carved channels around each pillar blank directly into the bedrock plateau, using flint tools and almost certainly thermal shock, heating the stone with fire and then dousing it with water to fracture along controlled lines. The quarry pits sit between 100 and 500 meters from the enclosures. Every pillar had to travel that distance across uneven terrain. There were no draft animals, no oxen, no horses. These would not be domesticated for another 5,000 years. No sledges have been found, no rollers, no ramps preserved in the archaeological record at the site. The only power source available was human muscle, and the only tools were stone. One pillar never made the journey. It still lies in the quarry today, partially freed from the bedrock but never lifted. At 6.9 meters long, in an estimated 50 tons, it would have been the largest single stone ever raised at Göbekli Tepe, taller than any pillar in the existing enclosures. Whatever stopped the quarry workers, they did not return to finish. The pillar remains where they left it, 12,000 years ago, like a sentence abandoned mid-word. Moving a finished pillar of even modest size, say 15 tons, across 500 meters of rocky hillside required coordination that no known hunter-gatherer society has ever demonstrated. Experimental archaeology suggests that shifting a single block of this weight with ropes, levers, and brute force would require between 400 and 500 people pulling in unison. But ethnographic studies of pre-agricultural societies consistently describe bands of 25 to 50 individuals. Even allowing for seasonal gatherings of multiple bands, the labor pool remains implausible without some form of organized surplus, food stored in advance to sustain the workforce. The paradox sharpens when you examine what is missing from the site. At layer 3, the oldest occupation level, where the great enclosures stand, there are no permanent dwellings. No hearths, no storage pits, no middens thick enough to indicate year-round habitation. The animal bones recovered from the fill are overwhelmingly wild: gazelle, aurochs, wild boar, hunted, not herded. The plant remains are wild cereals and pulses gathered from the surrounding steppe. The site had no residents. People came, they built, they performed whatever rituals the enclosures were designed for, and then they left. This is what separates Göbekli Tepe from every other Neolithic site on the planet. Jericho had homes. Çatalhöyük had homes. Even Schmidt's previous dig had domestic quarters alongside its ritual spaces. Göbekli Tepe had none. It was purely ceremonial, a cathedral without a city, a temple without a congregation that stayed. The logistics were staggering. Hundreds of people traveling from camps scattered across the Haram Plain, converging on this hilltop for long enough to quarry, shape, transport, and erect multi-ton pillars, then dispersing back into the landscape. The food to sustain them during construction had to come from somewhere. The authority to organize them had to come from someone. And the motivation had to be powerful enough to justify an investment of labor that, in caloric terms, could have fed a village for years. Schmidt spent the rest of his career trying to name that motivation. His answer was simple, and it was heretical. First came the temple, he told an interviewer in 2008. Then the city. Every textbook taught the opposite, that agriculture came first, then permanent settlement, then social complexity, then religion, then monumental architecture. Schmidt's pillars inverted the entire sequence. The stones did not lie, but neither did the absence of grain stores, of mud brick walls, of anything resembling a settled community. And that contradiction was only the beginning, because the surfaces of those pillars were not blank. They were covered, densely, obsessively, with images of creatures that no farmer would ever carve. The carvings begin at knee height and climb toward the top of each pillar in dense, overlapping compositions. More than 60 animal species have been identified across the excavated enclosures. Bears, boars, snakes, foxes, wildcats, aurochs, gazelle, cranes, vultures, scorpions, spiders, and creatures that defy easy classification. Some figures are small and tucked into corners. Others stretch across the full width of a pillar face, carved in high relief that protrudes up to 15 centimeters from the limestone surface. These are not scratched outlines. They are sculptural, as detailed as the gargoyles on a Gothic cathedral, except carved with flint chisels 8,000 years before Gothic cathedrals existed. The distribution is not random. Each enclosure favors a different dominant species. In enclosure A, snakes wind across nearly every pillar, coiled, elongated, sometimes intertwined in groups of 3 or 4. In enclosure B, foxes dominate, crouching, leaping, baring teeth. Enclosure C belongs to the boar, shown with bristled backs and curved tusks. Enclosure D, the largest and oldest, is ruled by birds. Vultures with spread wings, cranes with long necks bent as if mid-strike. The implication is difficult to ignore. Different enclosures may have been built by different groups, clans perhaps, or ritual societies, each identified by a totemic animal. Halfway down many of the T-shaped pillars, something else appears. Arms, human arms, carved in low relief along the narrow sides, bending at the elbow, hands reaching toward the front face, where a belt and loincloth are sometimes visible. The T-shape itself, the wide horizontal top above the narrow vertical body, suddenly resolves into a form, a head, shoulders, a stylized human figure standing motionless among the beasts. Or not human exactly, something taller, more abstract, more deliberate than a portrait. Schmidt called them beings. Whether they represent ancestors, deities, or spirits of the dead, no inscription exists to say. The relationship between these humanoid pillars and the animal carvings surrounding them remains one of the deepest open questions in Neolithic archaeology. The animals are not pastoral. Sheep, goats, and cattle, the staples of later farming cultures, barely appear. Instead, the menagerie is wild and threatening. Predators, scavengers, venomous creatures, foxes with bared fangs, scorpions with raised tails, boars mid-charge. This is not a scene of harmony between humans and nature. It reads more like a boundary, a threshold between the visible world and something else. In 2017, a team led by Julia Gresky of the German Archaeological Institute published a paper in Science Advances that added a new dimension to this threshold. Among the thousands of bone fragments recovered from the fill deposits of the enclosures, 3 stood out. They were portions of human skulls, parietal and frontal bones, and they had been modified after death. Deep, deliberate incisions ran along the sagittal axis of each skull, too regular and too deep to be accidental. One of the 3 also bore a drilled perforation near the top of the cranium and traces of red ochre pigment pressed into the bone surface. The drill hole had a function. A cord could be threaded through it. The skull could be hung. Gretzky's team concluded that these skulls represented a previously undocumented form of Neolithic skull cult, distinct from the plastered skulls of Jericho, distinct from the skull caches at Chayonu. The incisions were decorative or identificatory. The ochre was ritual. The suspension was display. Someone at Göbekli Tepe had selected specific individuals after death, removed their crania, carved and painted them, and hung them in a space surrounded by stone animals and silent anthropomorphic pillars. Whether these were honored ancestors or defeated enemies, the evidence does not say. What the evidence does say is that the people who came to this hilltop were not merely building structures. They were building a symbolic world, dense with meaning, governed by rules. And at the center of that world, human skulls watched from cords, turning slowly in the draft. The animals, the T-shaped beings, the suspended skulls. Together they formed the system, a pattern governed by principles that the builders understood, and we do not. The meaning stayed locked inside the stone. Locked. Until someone looked at one particular pillar and saw not animals, but stars. What Peter Benedict saw on that hilltop in 1963 was exactly what any trained anthropologist of his era would have seen. Limestone fragments scattered across a mound, some flint debitage, a low rise on the landscape with no visible architecture, no standing walls, no ceramic scatter, nothing that fit the profile of a significant pre-modern site. His survey notes describe the surface finds in 3 short paragraphs. The flint was noted. The limestone was noted. The conclusion followed the logic of its time. A disturbed medieval site, probably a cemetery, not worth a second visit. Benedict was not careless. He was working within a framework that could not accommodate what lay beneath his feet. In 1963, the pre-pottery Neolithic was still a young concept. Kathleen Kenyon had excavated Jericho's tower barely a decade earlier, and the idea that pre-agricultural people could build anything monumental was not on any archaeologist's horizon. A scatter of flint on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey suggested a campsite, maybe a burial ground, not a cathedral. The decades that followed were unkind to the region. From 1984 onward, southeastern Turkey's Kurdish provinces entered a conflict that lasted 15 years and displaced over 1 million people. Archaeological fieldwork slowed to a trickle. Foreign teams moved to safer ground, to western Turkey, to the Levant, to Cyprus. The hilltop near Şanlıurfa, a mound the size of 3 football fields, sat outside the boundary of active research, visited only by village farmers who worked the thin topsoil above the enclosures without knowing what lay beneath. Those farmers did damage. Each season, steel plows bit into the earth and scraped the upper surfaces of buried pillars. Fragments of carved limestone, animal reliefs, portions of anthropomorphic arms were pulled to the surface, tossed into field margins, or broken apart for use as building stone. Decades of plowing removed the uppermost layer of fill that had protected the enclosures for 10 millennia. By the time Schmidt arrived, the crowns of several pillars were already exposed at surface level, visible to anyone who thought to look down. What separated Schmidt from Benedict was not intelligence or training. It was nevaliciori. The years Schmidt had spent at that smaller site had loaded his visual memory with a specific vocabulary. T-shapes, animal reliefs, ritual deposits, the particular toolkit of pre-pottery Neolithic communities in the upper Euphrates region. When he read Benedict's survey notes in 1994, the Flynn descriptions triggered a pattern match that Benedict could never have made. The tools were not medieval. The debitage profile, the waste flakes, the core reduction sequences, was consistent with the 10th millennium BCE. Schmidt arrived on the hill carrying 30 years of accumulated knowledge that had not existed when Benedict left it. The discipline had moved on. The conceptual framework had expanded. What looked like noise in 1963 looked like a signal in 1994. The first full excavation season began in the summer of 1995 with a team of fewer than a dozen people. They opened a small trench on the southern slope. Within weeks, the outlines of 2 concentric rings of pillar bases became visible, and Schmidt understood that this was not a single monument. It was a complex, a repeated architectural program executed multiple times on the same hilltop, each iteration involving hundreds of workers and thousands of hours of coordinated labor. He called the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. The response was cautious. Radiocarbon samples were dispatched to laboratories. When the dates came back, confirming the late 10th millennium, the caution evaporated. Funding increased. The team expanded. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in the early 2000s revealed what the surface could not. Beneath the unexcavated portions of the mound, at least 16 additional anomalies, consistent with buried enclosures, each a potential match for the 4 already known. Farmers had been plowing over the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Complaining about the rocks. And an American anthropologist had stood on top of it in 1963, written 3 paragraphs, and walked away. Because the world he lived in did not yet have a category for what he was standing on. The gap between Benedict and Schmidt was 31 years, roughly the span of a professional career. In that interval, the entire discipline shifted beneath its own feet. The question now was not what else Schmidt would find at Göbekli Tepe, but what the carvings already uncovered actually meant. Pillar 43 stands in the northwestern quadrant of enclosure D. It is not the tallest pillar, not the most prominent. Visitors walk past it without pausing. From a distance, its surface looks like a crowded bestiary. Birds, insects, geometric marks layered over one another in a composition that borders on chaotic. Up close, the chaos resolves. At the center of the panel, a vulture with outstretched wings holds a circular disc above its right wing. Below the vulture, a headless human figure lies with arms extended. A scorpion occupies the lower left, its segmented tail curving upward. Above and around them, smaller figures cluster, an ibis-like bird, what appears to be a fox or a wolf, a series of H-shaped and V-shaped symbols scored into the limestone between the animals. The entire composition is framed by a thick horizontal band at the top of the pillar, a line that divides the carved world below from the blank stone above. For decades, Pillar 43 was catalogued simply as the Vulture Stone, one of the more elaborate carvings at the site, noteworthy for its density, but otherwise treated as part of the broader symbolic repertoire. Then, in 2017, a chemical engineer from the University of Edinburgh named Martin Sweatman published a paper that reframed the entire pillar. Sweatman argued that the animals on Pillar 43 were not decorative. They were astronomical. Each figure corresponded to a constellation. The vulture mapped to Sagittarius, the scorpion to Scorpius, the circular disk to the sun positioned at the summer solstice. The headless figure, Sweatman proposed, represented a catastrophic event. The date encoded in the pillar, according to Sweatman's calculations, was approximately 10,850 years before the Common Era. The onset of the Younger Dryas, a sudden climatic reversal that plunged the northern hemisphere back into near glacial conditions for over 1,200 years. Global temperatures dropped between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius. In Britain, glaciers advanced back across the Scottish Highlands. The River Thames froze solid. Across the Fertile Crescent, the cooling disrupted rainfall patterns and pushed human populations into narrower ecological bands, concentrating them around reliable water sources. The Younger Dryas is well documented in ice cores, ocean sediments, and pollen records. Its cause, however, remains contested. One hypothesis, championed by a group of researchers since 2007, is that the cooling was triggered by a swarm of comet fragments striking the northern hemisphere. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. Sweatman folded Pillar 43 into this framework. The headless figure is a human casualty. The vulture is death carrying the sun. And the V-shaped symbols scattered across the pillar are a tally, a calendar. In 2024, Sweatman expanded the argument in a paper published in Time and Mind, an academic journal of archaeology and cognitive science. He proposed that the V symbols on Pillar 43 encode a full lunisolar calendar, 365 days organized into 12 lunar months plus 11 epigomenal days. If correct, this is the oldest known calendrical system on Earth, predating the Egyptian civil calendar by more than 7,000 years. Another pillar at the site, he argued, depicts the Taurid meteor stream, the suspected source of the comet fragments, as a 27-day event emanating from the direction of Aquarius and Pisces. The reception has been mixed. Supporters call it a breakthrough in archaeoastronomy. Critics, including several members of the German Archaeological Institute's own Göbekli Tepe team, point out that mapping animal carvings to constellations involves a degree of subjective judgment that no statistical test can fully resolve. The vulture could be Sagittarius. It could also be a vulture. The scorpion could mark Scorpius on a star chart, or it could represent the actual scorpions that still crawl across the hilltop at night. Correlation is not inscription, and without a written key, any astronomical reading of a 12,000-year-old animal carving remains a hypothesis, not a proof. Sweatman has acknowledged this. If this is right, he told an interviewer, it means someone was tracking the sky with precision 12,000 years before Ptolemy. If it's wrong, we still have the most complex symbolic composition in the pre-pottery Neolithic, and no better explanation for what it means. A calendar, a cosmic record, maybe even a warning, carved into stone by people who witnessed something falling from the sky and wanted future generations to remember the date. The argument remains open. The pillar remains in the ground, facing northwest, the vulture holding its disk toward a point in the sky that has not been the summer solstice for 11,000 years. Göbekli Tepe alone would have been extraordinary. A single hilltop temple built before agriculture, covered in carvings that might encode the heavens. Except Göbekli Tepe is not alone, And that changes the scale of this story entirely. 46 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, across a landscape of dry grass and pistachio orchards, another hilltop rises above the Haran plain. Karahan Tepe, Black Hill, was first documented in 1997, 3 years after Schmidt began digging. Surface surveys found the same signatures: flint debitage consistent with the pre-pottery Neolithic, broken limestone slabs, and what appeared to be the tops of T-shaped pillars protruding from eroded soil. For 2 decades, the site was noted in the literature and left alone. Funding and attention were focused on Göbekli Tepe. Karahan Tepe waited. Systematic excavations began in 2019 under the Turkish Ministry of Culture's Taş Tepeler initiative, Stone Hills, a coordinated research program that expanded the lens from a single site to an entire region. Taş Tepeler identified approximately 12 pre-pottery Neolithic sites within a 100-kilometer radius of Göbekli Tepe, each bearing the architectural fingerprints of the same building tradition: T-shaped pillars, circular enclosures, animal carvings, ritual deposits, and no evidence of permanent habitation. Göbekli Tepe was not an anomaly. It was the center of a constellation. Karahan Tepe delivered its first major revelation in 2021. Excavators uncovered a subterranean chamber carved directly into the bedrock, not built from transported blocks, but subtracted from the living rock, like a sculpture in reverse. 11 pillars rise from the chamber floor, arranged in a semicircle around a seated human figure that emerges from the back wall. The figure's face is featureless. Its posture is rigid. Its hands rest on its knees. The pillars surrounding it are carved with snakes, dozens of them, winding down the shafts in continuous spirals. Nothing like this chamber exists at Göbekli Tepe. In September 2023, the Karahan Tepe excavation unearthed a 2.3-meter tall anthropomorphic statue, the largest figurative sculpture ever recovered from the pre-pottery Neolithic. Its face carries a naturalistic expression, unlike anything previously found at this period. Defined cheekbones, closed eyes, a slightly parted mouth. It dates to the 10th millennium BCE, and it looks like a portrait. Then came the T-shaped pillar with a human face. Found during the same season at Karahan Tepe, it is the first T-pillar in the entire Taş Tepeler network to feature recognizable facial features carved directly into the stone. Not schematic arms or belt markings, but eyes, a nose, a jawline. The abstract anthropomorphic form that Schmidt had identified at Göbekli Tepe suddenly had a face. And that face raised a question that no one had previously needed to ask. Who was being depicted? Back at Göbekli Tepe, the 2025 excavation season, led by Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, in partnership with the German Archaeological Institute and the Şanlıurfa Museum, produced another first. A painted boar statue, roughly half a meter long, was recovered from enclosure D. The surface retained visible pigments, red, white, and black, applied in bands across the animal's back and flanks. Pigment analysis confirmed the coloring was intentional, not mineral staining. It is among the oldest known examples of painted sculpture anywhere on Earth. The scope of the Taş Tepeler network spans an area roughly the size of Belgium. A ceremonial landscape operating 3,000 years before the first pyramid in Egypt and 5,000 years before anyone in Mesopotamia pressed a stylus into wet clay. 12 sites, possibly more, each with its own architectural character, its own dominant carvings, its own variations on the T-shaped pillar program, yet all sharing a common construction logic, a common ritual vocabulary, and a common absence of the one thing that every model of social complexity requires: agriculture. At Göbekli Tepe itself, only about 10% of the site has been excavated. The remaining 90% lies beneath the mound, an archaeological reservoir that, at current pace, will take roughly a century and a half to open fully. 10%. 90% still underground. A network of temples built by people who had no cities, no metal, no writing. The question was no longer how they built it. The question was why. And the answer that Klaus Schmidt proposed shattered a century of archaeological consensus. For most of the 20th century, the sequence was not debated. Agriculture came first, settled villages followed, social hierarchy emerged from the concentration of surplus grain, religion crystallized as a means of codifying rules within growing communities, and monumental architecture, temples, ziggurats, pyramids, appeared last, as the physical expression of societies complex enough to marshal labor on a grand scale. This was the Neolithic Revolution, as defined by V. Gordon Childe in 1936, and no major archaeological discovery had challenged its order. Until Göbekli Tepe. Schmidt's argument was not subtle. He proposed that the entire sequence ran in reverse. The impulse to build a sacred space came before the need to grow food. Groups of hunter-gatherers, drawn to the hilltop by a shared belief system, invested extraordinary labor in constructing a monument that none of them individually required. The sustained presence of hundreds of workers on the hilltop created a logistical problem: feeding them. And that problem, Schmidt believed, forced the transition from gathering wild cereals to deliberately cultivating them. The temple did not emerge from agriculture. Agriculture emerged from the temple. The evidence was uncomfortably specific. In 1997, a team of geneticists led by Manfred Hoyn published a study in Science tracing the origin of domesticated einkorn wheat. Using DNA analysis of 68 modern and ancient einkorn strains, they identified the wild progenitor population in the Karakadach Mountains, a volcanic range 60 kilometers southeast of Göbekli Tepe. The genetic data placed the initial domestication event in the early 9th millennium BCE, precisely overlapping with the period of peak construction at the site. The first farmers on Earth lived within 3 days' walk of the oldest temple on Earth, and the timing was not coincidental. Schmidt was careful to frame this as correlation, not causation. Others were less restrained. The popular press ran headlines about the temple that invented farming. Academic critics pushed back, arguing that the proximity of early einkorn domestication to Göbekli Tepe proved nothing about directionality, that both could have emerged independently from the same dense, resource-rich environment. The Haran Plain in the 10th millennium was not a desert. It was a lush grassland, thick with wild game and cereal stands. Perhaps the same environmental abundance that allowed hunter-gatherers to build temples also nudged some of those groups toward cultivation. Parallel developments, not a causal chain. The debate remains unresolved. What is resolved is the chronology. Monumental architecture at Göbekli Tepe precedes the earliest evidence of agriculture in the region by several centuries. Whether one caused the other or both emerged from common conditions, the traditional sequence, farming then temples, is broken. There is a second mystery embedded in the site, quieter but no less strange. At some point between approximately 8,500 and 8,000 BCE, the enclosures were filled in. Hundreds of cubic meters of limestone rubble, animal bones, flint tools, and soil were packed into and around the structures, burying the pillars up to their capstones. In enclosure D, the fill reached a depth sufficient to cover pillars standing 5.5 meters tall, a volume roughly equivalent to 50 standard shipping containers of material, deliberately transported and deposited. The original archaeological consensus, established by Schmidt himself, held that this was intentional, a ritual closing, a de-sanctification. In cultures across the ancient Near East, sacred objects and buildings were sometimes killed, broken, inverted, or buried to neutralize their power before abandonment. Several pillars at Göbekli Tepe show signs of damage that appear controlled rather than accidental. Carved faces defaced along clean lines, portions of relief removed symmetrically, one pillar apparently extracted whole from its socket and relocated. The pattern suggested a ceremony, an ending, a deliberate decision to seal the temple and walk away. In 2025, a counter-argument gained traction. Geoarchaeological analysis of the fill deposits revealed stratified layers, thin, horizontally bedded sediment bands consistent with gradual hillside erosion rather than rapid, intentional dumping. If the enclosures had been buried all at once, the fill should be homogeneous. Instead, it looks like centuries of natural sedimentation, rain washing soil downslope, wind depositing dust, vegetation cycles trapping debris in and around the abandoned structures. Not a ritual burial, a slow drowning. The truth may be a combination. Some enclosures show clear signs of controlled closure. Others show stratification that suggests neglect. What both explanations share is an endpoint, a moment, whether abrupt or gradual, when the people who had built and maintained these structures for over 1,000 years stopped coming. They stopped carving. They stopped gathering. The hilltop fell silent. And the stone beings, arms at their sides, animals frozen on their surfaces, skulls no longer hanging from cords, stood alone in the filling dark, waiting for someone to uncover them. Schmidt spent 2 decades defending his inversion of the Neolithic sequence. He published, he lectured, he debated. He brought journalists to the hilltop and pointed at the pillars. He never saw the argument fully accepted. In July 2014, while swimming in a lake near Şanlıurfa during the excavation off-season, the protective shelter over Göbekli Tepe, a tension fabric canopy supported by steel arches, covers roughly 4,000 square meters. Beneath it, the 4 excavated enclosures sit open to the air, their pillars stabilized, their walls shored with modern masonry where needed. Walkways allow visitors to circle above the enclosures without descending into them. On a busy day, 1,000 people pass through. They see what has been revealed. They do not see what has not. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in stages between 2003 and 2012 mapped the subsurface of the entire mound at multiple depths. The results confirmed what Schmidt had suspected from the surface topography. Beneath the unexcavated portions of the hill, at least 20 additional anomalies are consistent with buried enclosures, circular or oval structures with dense, high reflectivity features at their centers, matching the profile of T-shaped pillar pairs. 20 enclosures, possibly more. The 4 that are open to visitors represent less than 1/5 of the architectural program that the radar suggests. The excavation rate is constrained by the fragility of what lies beneath. Each pillar, once exposed, begins to weather. Limestone that survived 12 millennia under compacted fill degrades within decades in open air. Thermal cycling, moisture, biological colonization. The German Archaeological Institute and Istanbul University have agreed on a protocol that limits the pace of excavation to what can be conserved in real time. At that pace, full excavation of the remaining mound will take approximately 150 years. 150 years. If work began today and continued without interruption, the lost enclosure at Göbekli Tepe would be uncovered around the year 2175. Further in the future than the American Civil War is in the past. New technology is accelerating what can be learned without digging. LiDAR scanning of the excavated enclosures, carried out in 2023 and 24, has revealed tool marks on pillar surfaces that are invisible to the naked eye. Shallow scoring patterns, alignment grooves, traces of pigment residue in recesses too fine for conventional photography. Three-dimensional photogrammetry has produced sub-millimeter digital models of every carved surface, allowing researchers to study the carvings remotely and to detect modifications that occurred at different periods. Later additions layered over original compositions. The 2025 excavation season, the most recent to produce published results, yielded a human statue found in the fill between enclosures B and D. The figure, carved from a single block of limestone, features a clearly defined head and torso, with facial proportions more naturalistic than any previously recovered at the site. Unlike the rigid, stylized T-pillar forms, this statue has articulated shoulders and what appears to be a forward lean, as if caught in motion. Its context, the fill between two enclosures rather than inside one, suggests it may have been part of a surface-level display rather than an interior installation. Necmi Karol, the Turkish prehistorian who has directed the joint excavations since Schmidt's death, has described the current phase of research as learning to read a library when we've only opened 4 books. The metaphor is precise. Each enclosure has its own dominant species, its own carving style, its own pillar proportions. The variations suggest that the building program spanned centuries, possibly a millennium, with each generation or group leaving its own signature in stone. What looks from the surface like a single mound is in fact a layered archive, a record of 1,000 years of ritual activity compressed into a hilltop that measures 300 meters across. Beneath the unexcavated 90%, the radar shows shapes, circles, corridors, clusters of high-density reflections that might be pillar concentrations, or might be collapsed walls, or might be something that does not fit any category yet defined. The instruments can see the outlines. They cannot see the carvings. They cannot read the faces. They cannot count the animals, or check for calendars, or find more skulls with cords threaded through their crowns. For that, someone will need to dig. Carefully, slowly, one season at a time, for longer than any single archaeologist's career. We mapped the human genome in 13 years. Göbekli Tepe will take 150. On July the 20th, 2014, Klaus Schmidt went swimming in a lake near Şanlıurfa. It was the off-season, the weeks between excavation campaigns when the team scattered, when the equipment was stored, when the hilltop sat empty under the summer heat. Schmidt was 59 years old. He had led 19 consecutive excavation seasons at Göbekli Tepe, every summer since 1995, without a single year missed. He suffered a heart attack in the water and did not resurface.
The news reached the archaeological community within hours. Tributes arrived from Berlin, from Istanbul, from London and Chicago and Jerusalem. They used words like visionary and transformative. They were not wrong. Schmidt had spent 2 decades arguing a single proposition: that the human need to build sacred spaces preceded the human need to farm. And the proposition had reshaped the field around him, slowly, unevenly, the way water reshapes limestone. He was buried in Şanlıurfa, the city closest to his life's work. The hilltop is 8 kilometers to the northeast. On clear days, you can see it from the road that leads to the cemetery. Göbekli Tepe now receives over 1 million visitors per year. Tour buses park at the base of the hill. A visitor center displays replicas of the pillars and a timeline that places the site before every other monument in the standard chronology. School groups walk the elevated platforms above Enclosure D, pointing at the animals carved into stone, asking their teachers what the vulture is holding. The teachers give different answers. Schmidt's core argument, the inversion, remains debated. A growing number of archaeologists accept its broad outline, that ritual activity and monumental construction at Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites preceded agriculture in the region. The strict version, that the temple directly caused farming, has fewer adherents. Most researchers now favor a more nuanced reading, that the same social and cognitive capacities that allowed hunter-gatherers to organize monumental construction also enabled them to experiment with plant cultivation, and that the two innovations emerged from the same cultural pressure, in the same place, within the same few centuries. The temple and the grain field are siblings, not parent and child. What no one disputes is the question that Schmidt forced into the open. Before Göbekli Tepe, it was possible to believe that complex symbolic behavior, organized labor, and monumental architecture required farming, cities, and writing as prerequisites. After Göbekli Tepe, that belief is no longer tenable. 12,000 years ago, people with no metal, no wheels, no written language, and no permanent homes carved multi-ton pillars from bedrock, raised them upright, arranged them in circles, covered them with images of animals and gods and stars, hung human skulls from cords inside the enclosures, and then, after 1,000 years, stopped. They filled the spaces with rubble. They walked away. And the hill grew silent. Schmidt spent 19 years uncovering a place that its builder spent perhaps 1,000 years constructing. Both worked without any certainty that anyone would understand what they had made. Both trusted that the stone would speak for itself. The stone is still speaking. Most of it has not yet been heard.